Welcome to SilviCast, the podcast about all things silviculture. My name is Brad Hutnick.
And I'm Greg Edge.
And we're both silviculturists with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources and your host for today's show. Happy birthday, Greg.
Hey, thanks, Brad.
So how does it feel to be, old growth? I mean,
Hey,
you're nearing rotation, my friend, and I see some parts might be senescing, a few more holes in the old canopy. You know what I mean?
Brad, I'm like literally only 6 months older than you.
Yeah, but stand history has a lot to do with condition. When you've been as well managed as I have, the mean annual increment peaks much later. And with your stand history, Greg, well, let's just say you might need to start thinking about some, intermediate treatments, more restorative treatments. You've got some, maybe some legacy characteristics, my friend.
Oh, like what?
Well, gray hair, for instance.
My hair's not gray.
Well, but you dye your hair.
I do not dye my hair. And what's that you're always telling me, Brad? You're not old unless you stop learning.
We'll talk about your gray hair, but when did I say that?
Like 5 minutes ago, old timer.
Oh, well, that is a good quote. Always keep your mind young, Greg, and don't fret about those old growth characteristics. That is, unless you are a forest, because today we'll be talking about old growth management, and not just passive management, but using silvicultural techniques to enhance old growth characteristics. Joining us today on SilviCast is Paul Catanzaro, professor and state extension forester at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst.
I'm sorry, Brad. What did you say? I dozed off.
This season of SilviCast is brought to you by the Nelson Paint Company, McCoy Construction and Forestry, and the Family Forest Carbon Program. You make the SilviCast world go round, so thank you. Paul Catanzaro, welcome to SilviCast. Before we begin, tell us a little bit about where you work and what you do.
Well, I'm a state extension forester at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. I'm also a professor in the Forest Ecology and Conservation Program, our forestry program at UMass. And I serve as the co-director of the Family Forest Research Center, which is a partnership between the USDA Forest Service and UMass, where we focus our research efforts on better understanding the goals, challenges, decisions of family forest owners across the country.
Wow, cool.
Well, welcome, Paul.
Yeah,
thanks. I'm excited to be here.
Well, we're excited to have you here. And Greg, we always start these. We always ask people. So, and I'm always curious, what got you interested in forestry and forest management, or just being, natural resource management?
Great question. Well, it wasn't the money.
Oh, come on.
I grew up outside of Buffalo, New York, and I went to a Presbyterian church there that had a very active youth group. And the minister of that church happened to be an outdoor enthusiast. And so he would lead a trip every spring to Algonquin Provincial Park, a canoe trip for about, a week or so at a time. And then in the wintertime, a much smaller subset, a much hardier subset of us used to go up to Algonquin on a snowshoe trip for a long weekend and do some winter camping.
Oh, wow.
And, I think forests always resonated with me, but certainly being up in Algonquin, being in that wilderness context, just really, I think, planted the seed or allowed the seed to grow, if you will. And it was a passion that I guess I felt compelled to come back to. My undergraduate degree is in cultural anthropology. So I'm really fascinated with culture and people and how people organize and make decisions and things. So I'm fond of saying it's my forestry degree that makes me a forester, and it's my cultural anthropology degree that makes me a good one. But I ultimately, after undergrad, decided I wanted to / needed to follow that passion of forestry, and then went ahead to pursue graduate work.
That's cool that you had a leader that took you on those trips.
Yeah, to be honest, when I think about the liability these days,
I know, right.
Both, having, I don't know, we had 3-4 vans. We probably had 20 to 30 high school age kids out there, and then on the snowshoe trips, maybe a dozen carabinered across frozen lakes. That's a gutsy thing.
Yeah.
I've met a lot of foresters who did something else before coming to forestry or kind of had some background outside of that. And I always think they bring something else to the table. They bring something extra to the table that, like, if you just go to the woods straight out of school, it seems like you don't quite get that.
Yeah, I agree with that. Forestry is such a wonderfully dynamic, complex, both system and science that I think we benefit. It enriches our thinking, it enriches our research and our all aspects of our work. And we have those different perspectives. It's a wonderful stew. So for me, it's more on the social side. And I'll be honest, my graduate degree is in silviculture. I'm a silviculture geek. I've been waiting for years to get an invite to this podcast, so I feel like I finally made it.
Oh boy.
But I really fully expected, when I first came out of school, I really fully expected and wanted to be a consulting forester and spend my days working with family forest owners in their woods, helping them make decisions. But I will tell you, after a few years of working in the field, in recognizing that the decisions they were making at the kitchen table was as important or more important than when they were making in the woodlot, I really started shifting a little bit more towards the social science. But I got to keep a boot in the silviculture camp because I love it. It's such a wonderful, stimulating subject.
I thought maybe Tony D'Amato waved you off of us, like not going there. Don't go there.
No. He's like, oh, those guys are fun. He's like, you're gonna have fun.
Yeah, something like Beyond This Point, like
Yeah,
dragons.
Beyond here. Yeah.
Paul, Brad recently gave me a publication that you and Tony D'Amato actually put together, Restoring Old Growth Characteristics to New England and New York's Forests. I hadn't seen that before. I'm not sure when it was published, but we both thought that was a really cool, just kind of synthesis of how foresters can maybe look at old growth and incorporate old growth tactics and management techniques into their silvicultures. So we thought that's a topic that we got to talk about. We do here in Wisconsin have the managed old growth silvicultural study going on over the years, but we just thought this was a really nice synthesis, and we said, oh, we got to talk about that. And so that was kind of our motivation today, and thing that we wanted to cover with you.
Yeah, the work really comes out of Tony's PhD work. Tony got his PhD at UMass Amherst. As the story goes, I was hired for my current position at UMass, and they, of course, promised me an office. And I moved into my office only to find out that it was the office that Tony used, and they kicked him out. And I got his office, and he was moved to the adjoining office next door. And so we had an interior door that joined our offices, and we just shared a lot of personal and professional similarities. And so we became quick friends and colleagues. And he was comparing in his PhD work here in Massachusetts, defining the actual old growth that we have in Massachusetts, and then comparing those to our second growth forests. And we'll define those terms maybe in a minute. But we were really, interested in this topic. And I will say that when he was going through, wow, he's getting old now, but when he was going through his PhD work,
he's coming to rotation. He's coming to
rotation,
right?
Easily. Yeah.
Tony, careful.
There was a real and continues to be a good and important emphasis on early successional habitat, shrubby habitats and so forth, and the recognition of these important declining species. But there wasn't a whole lot of conversation on the other end of the successional spectrum. And Tony, who had done, graduate work in Oregon and then came to UMass to sort of do this comparative kind of work with Dave Orwig as his advisor at Harvard Forest. And so the work we started engaging with isn't necessarily new. I mean, people in the Pacific Northwest in particular have been looking at these ideas, Franklin and others, of restoring old growth characteristics and things. What we were very intrigued by was, how do you take these concepts and how do you apply them in a landscape that's dominated by family forest owners with a smattering of, state lands, county lands, land trust, conservation org lands. It's a different, when you're looking at whole landscapes, it's sort of one approach, but when you're looking at assemblages of 40, 60 acre, parcels, it really becomes a different kind of approach and strategy. So we were sort of taken with, well, how do you do that? How do you take these approaches and apply those in these landscapes? And so we originally published work in 2007, and it really sort of focused on Massachusetts, northern hardwoods and things. And it was a good publication and we enjoyed it. And I hope it got a little bit of traction. But, like as what happens with life, we sort of moved on to other areas. About 2 springs ago, we were contacted by a woman at the Vermont Land Trust, Liz Thompson, who said, hey, you two should really think about in the context of climate change and sequestration and storage and resilience and biodiversity and so forth. You two should really think about dusting those old publications off and updating them with a bigger context. And so that's what we did with this latest publication. We expanded it to New York and New England from just sort of southern New England, and really also gave it a climate change lens as well as a biodiversity lens. And so it's been a really fun project to work on.
It's neat that you talked about applying these things in a private ownership type of landscape, because that's really relevant to us here in Wisconsin too. So especially in the southern 2/3 of the state, it's primarily privately owned woodlots. So that's good. I think foresters will be interested in that.
Yeah, I hope so. Before diving into sort of the old growth definitions and things, I like to take a step back and think about the land use history that we're talking about. And the land use history changes a little bit between the Northeast and the Midwest, but there's some real striking similarities. Our landscapes have were largely dominated by forests, and those forests, were the natural vegetation type. And so one of the things, and they were exposed to, or they were subjected to, some pretty significant colonial land use practices. And so one of the things that I think is really critical for us to recognize is that the forests of today are different. They're ecologically young relative to what would have been here pre-colonial. And so as foresters, one of the things I'm really proud of and I love about our profession is we consider long time frames. And so, we stretching ourselves beyond decades or even a century or two, thinking through what those characteristics of forests were and what is different about our current forests, I think is a really good and important exercise. And then, diving into, well, if we do want to recruit some of those or change that difference and achieve those characteristics, how do we do that?
Are the forests that you have now very similar? So good example, like you had northern hardwood, you still have northern hardwood, or has there been a type transition in some of these areas that you're looking at?
That's a great question. I do think, some of the work that Charlie Cogbill and others have done, at least up in our neck of the woods, do show some compositional differences. One of the most striking ones, of course, would be the loss of chestnut, so the loss of species within our landscape. When we talk about restoring old growth characteristics, much of the work historically, and even the work that we're doing, really does focus on the structural attributes. And so we can talk about what some of those structural attributes are. But one of the knobs we really tried to turn up in this new publication was a focus on species composition, which we feel is very important in the face of the threats that our forests are dealing with. So everything from climate change to changes in, of course, that come with it, the drought and so forth, but also things such as invasive insects. Particularly in the Northeast, we're really in a sort of a real hot zone, so to speak, in a bad way, of these invasive insects. So keeping an eye on achieving not only our structural targets through silviculture and passive approaches, but also keeping an eye on what are we regenerating and what are we moving stands towards from a species compositional perspective. And so I think that's the real trick, achieving the structural goals while we're achieving our compositional goals. And that's that's the fun, right? That's the silviculture of it, and rolling our sleeves up and engaging with that.
We were having this conversation the other day about just the invasive species, invasive pests have really changed that landscape in a way. So it becomes even more challenging to work with some of these aspects of these forest systems.
It does, and one of the things we'll talk about is considering these strategies not as a here's your cookie cutter, here you go, this is how you do it in your forest
Mm-hmm.
and in all forests and all landscapes. That's never worked with forestry, and again, that's the art of the
Right.
silviculture. But there's a gradient of approaches that can be implemented out in a woodlot or in a landscape that can both meet landowner goals, because all landowners have a different combination of goals, and also meet our species compositional targets as well. So, for example, many of the species predicted to do better in the future tend to be more on the shade intolerant and mid-tolerant side because of their characteristics for drought tolerance and so forth. That takes more sunlight. So I think when people hear old growth, restoration, they immediately think of single tree selection and shade tolerance, which can absolutely be a part of it. But, how do we, incorporate some of that mid-tolerant and intolerant regeneration into it? And that's sort of the gradient of these approaches.
Right. I never thought of it, but so when you're talking about it, and Greg, this is just not a rabbit hole, but just a very it's a gopher hole. If you're focusing on structure, then you can deal with like a novel composition kind of coming into these sites. Because like you just mentioned, you lost chestnut, you don't have that. Or if you have these new species coming in, but you still have a continuity of structure or some mimicking the same processes you had historically.
Absolutely. And when we think about the ecosystem services that we are trying to achieve, particularly things like biodiversity, wildlife, that's a structural response, water quality, structural response. Certainly different species are providing different mass and different kinds of benefits. But I think we're looking forward. I don't think it's a stretch to say we're looking at new combinations of species and hopefully complex structure. And that's I think one of the big points to emphasize is that one of the things that I get very concerned about in terms of the passive approach in particular is citing these in areas that might have threats like invasive plants, for example, that are or at least in the Northeast excessive herbivory that are simplifying our forests, that aren't leading to these wonderfully highly complex, multi-layer, heterogeneous forests that are characteristic of old growth that I think we want to try to move to. And I worry that this is one of the two things that keeps me up at night. I worry that some of these challenges may be interfering with the processes that we've relied on for so long, that forests are so have made forests so resilient.
Brad, I saw you chewing on that gopher hole up there, and I know at your stage of stand development, it takes a while to get those thoughts out. So we'll just let that. That's all okay. It's all good.
Structural diversity, Greg. It's a good thing.
Paul, could you say something about just how you would define some of those common terms we would use, such as old growth or old forest? Not necessarily the same thing.
This is a pretty hot debate, at least up here in the Northeast.
It's everywhere.
And these conversations on federal lands about what's mature and so forth. And so there are a lot of definitions floating around, and so I can share with you the definitions we chose to go with, and I guess they are the same. They're consistent from the 2007 publication through today. So that is, old growth forests are those forests that were never directly impacted by intensive colonial land use. And by that, I specifically mean agriculture and logging. So those forests that really have never been touched by those land uses, we would characterize, or we do characterize, as old growth forests. And of course, that's the vast minority of our landscapes. The bulk of our landscapes are what we would call second growth forests. So those forests that regenerated post-agricultural use, mostly pasture, And also those forests that may have been primary woodlots, so they may have been a woodlot associated with a farmstead or a homestead, maybe it was never cleared for pasture or for crop production, but it was used for building material, fuel wood, etc. So we would consider, old growth, those forests that were never directly impacted by agriculture and timber harvesting, and second growth, basically everything else that has grown back since. Now, the difference between our first publication and the second publication is we added a term. We added this term old forest in recognition that at some point, second growth forests, we hope, and this is what we're promoting, I guess, can and should develop characteristics that are similar in type and scale to old growth forest. So we're not suggesting that the forest, becomes old growth forest. Frankly, we don't know what all those relationships are that maybe we don't know about or we're missing. But we can, at least those measurable characteristics, those benchmarks such as large tree size, heterogeneity, differences in the structural complexity and so forth, those things can and are accruing in our forests. And conceivably, unless something changes, such as invasive plants or herbivory, et cetera, our forests will move to that old forest condition. So we wanted to recognize that yes, it's not just second growth forest, that at some point through either a passive or an active strategy, we can, encourage our forests to move in that direction to achieve those critical benchmarks.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really nice way to frame it, especially for our forests in the eastern United States, where you do have this just great land use change with European settlement. And so you do have that original structure and composition, and then you have this second growth aspect to it, but now that is aging. So I just like the way that that's framed.
We talked about that. People have offered a lot of different, there's a lot of different definitions floating around. That just feels simple. That's not to say it's not accurate, but it feels simple, straightforward, easy to communicate, and measurable. I think that's an important and ecologic, has a grounding ecologically. So with those definitions, I can't underscore enough that our forests have been changed. And even though, we love our forests and they provide tremendous amounts of public benefit, they're different. They're relatively speaking, they're ecologically young. And 80 or 100-year-old for a human is pretty old. But, generally speaking, a lot of our forests are in that 80 to 100-year-old age class. And that's young ecologically. When we think about the mechanisms that create these old growth structures and things, it takes centuries for that to happen. Whether it be the size of the tree or the decay, the amount of dead wood, the heterogeneity vertically and horizontally, those are all a part of regular disturbances affecting our forests with some mortality, and so it takes a long time for that to develop. Now, the good news is at 80 to 100 years, we're starting to see that. Our forests, our stand development are getting to that point. You can walk out and see trees that are over 20 inches, 25 inches. You can see dead wood. I mean, that's all good stuff. But the reality is that, we're just sort of at the front end of that development. And it would likely take, another 100 years from a passive approach perspective to probably accrue the amount that we're starting to get in the ballpark of old growth forests. And then there are these active approaches that we feel that you can employ to help, speed up that successional clock and maybe, achieve some of these characteristics at a faster pace.
Yeah. What I love about it too is that it's really forestry being relevant to a current conversation. Like we're not trying to mourn the loss of something that's gone. We can't change that past land use, but we can set the stage for having better conditions in these stands in the future, which is consistent with what we've done. This is just one more objective kind of reaching toward that.
I've had a really positive experience. So I'm an extension guy. That's what I do. So I go out and I love it. And, I go out and talk to landowners and foresters and land trusts and municipalities and things. And I have found this to be a wonderful framework for communicating silviculture and our role within it, because there are opportunities, everybody fits in. So if you're interested in taking a more intensive approach, maybe on the shade intolerant side, there are strategies that you can employ to help, boost the restoring old growth characteristics. If you want to take a passive approach, that fits into the landscape too. We need some of that, both at all scales, at the stand level, at the property level, at the landscape level. So it has been a really powerful communication tool to help people reduce the bifurcation of I'm a cut everything or I'm a cut nothing person, and help people see the synthesis across the landscape of how these approaches on that gradient, add up across the landscape to really give us the diversity, age class, species, structural, et cetera, that I think we need, both from a resilience perspective, but also from a wildlife perspective, different age classes, that shifting mosaic of disturbance that we naturally would have seen. So it's been a wonderful tool. People are really interested in climate change and carbon, and for very good and important reason. And, we can talk about that. We can talk about these carbon pools and increasing dead wood and in soil and large tree contributions. We could talk about the niche rich environment that these, old growth characteristics, give to our forests. And there's also, I think there's a powerful message to be delivered in regard to engaging in forests in a way that help restore them. We expect a tremendous amount of benefit from in fact, we rely on it. It's essential to our lives. And there's something good and right about the reciprocity of going, into a forest and not only taking, but restoring back to it some of those characteristics that are missing. And that, I will be honest, and I want to make sure I give proper attribution. I was reading Breeding Sweetgrass on the beach this summer, and these concepts of reciprocity or Leopold's land ethic and things really were swirling around my mind when I was thinking about this restoration of these characteristics.
Mm-hmm. We've been talking about, and it's ironic, we've been talking about restoration and forest management almost being two separate spheres. Like there's a world of ecological restoration and there's a world of forestry. And I think there's starting to be a little more kind of overlap between those. And eventually you would think that there would be there shouldn't be, it should be one in a lot of ways.
I think too, it goes back to what you said, Paul, in the beginning of just being holistic across that landscape. We know the vast majority of our forests are sort of in this age bubble of 80 to 100. And we're working on the young aspect, and that's important, but we also have to work on the old aspect. So it's kind of keeping all of that in the picture across the landscape.
Absolutely. When I give a presentation, I like to show numbers of what the amount of old growth forest is, which, in Massachusetts, based on Tony's dissertation, is 1,119 acres. Across New England, if you look at it, across New England, I will be honest, we wimped out in the publication and said, less than 1%, of forest these days. But it's not less than 1%. It's like less than 0.01. I mean, it's like, it's decimal places. Mm-hmm. So what do we do with the other 99% of the landscape, which is second growth forest that would have historically been old growth? And I'm a huge old growth fan. I hope we find more of it. I don't know if we're going to find thousands of acres more of it. So to me, the compelling work is, all right, but we've got, these wonderful landscapes that have rebounded. What do we do with them? How do we use old growth as that model, as that template? And how do we engage with our forests in a way that sort of honors what they were and helps restore that while still, achieving our broad societal goals?
So if we're interested in getting to having more of that older age class on this distribution, why not just manage a certain percentage passively?
And I think there's good and important reason to do that. And I know I'm no matter who I talk to, I'm sort of always getting tomatoes thrown at me. So when I'm talking to foresters and I say, I think it's good and important we use some passive approaches, I get tomatoes thrown at me. When I'm talking to a group that doesn't believe in cutting trees and I suggest you can, cut trees, I get tomatoes thrown at me. So I, I, I think it's really important. I don't really see these as opposing kinds of perspectives or strategies. I think particularly in our parcelized landscape, it's just critically important to look across these boundary lines and be thinking about how to knit these forests back together, how to restore some of these characteristics with whatever strategy we choose, active or passive. How do you restore the characteristics and build a critical mass across the landscape that sort of knits itself together? And the passive approach is a very good and important one. Mm-hmm. If our forests have done nothing, they have shown us they're highly resilient, right? I mean, they in New England here, we've tried to cut these suckers twice and they just keep coming back. It's like they just keep growing, and it's our blessing, right? We've got these wonderful soils, young soils, they're nutrient and great precipitation and wonderful. So we can take a passive and should take a passive approach across our landscape. Now, I guess part of this gets into my personal bias, so take it with a grain of salt. I think we should have some areas that we allow these disturbances to be the main driver. So it's wind, for us in our region, it's sort of wind and ice largely, maybe some fires in some unique situations, insect disease, and that will create the mortality that will lead to the characteristics over time, over the next century. So we can do that. That means if you take that approach, that does mean having an appetite for disturbance, or at least not going in and salvaging, or at least limiting your salvaging, because it's that disturbance that's actually creating the structure we're interested in. And I started my career as a service forester, which I loved, and I would go and do woods walks with landowners, and it was inevitable when you're walking on a trail with a landowner, they sort of bend down and pick up their stick, the stick and the tree over, and they want to clean it up. We sort of have a Disney World view of forests being these clean things, but allowing that disturbance to be that agent of disturbance and creating that structure is important. So I think there are some important and just having that benchmark, having some areas that we can refer to and say, yeah, this is what happens when you do nothing. It's different. And from a carbon perspective, that passive approach will maximize the storage of carbon. I think that's, important to recognize as well. So there's good, very good. And things like plant communities that understory plant communities that don't do well in disturbance, they're good reason to do that. And you might have a client that is interested in that. There might be a landowners that are, or conservation organizations, municipalities. And I would encourage us to think of that passive approach on a variety of scales. So there may be, and there certainly are opportunities in all silvicultural strategies to leave legacy trees or patches within a stand. Or you could go out a scale and leave a stand as a passive approach within a larger matrix of managed forest. Or you could leave the entire property, within that as a passive, approach. So there are a variety of scales that can be used to achieve that passive. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. And so from a siting perspective, I think if that is of interest to you or your landowner, I think trying to key in on these sites that are high integrity, that don't have the presence of a lot of invasive plants, for example, or really high deer herbivory. The passive approach depends on, I guess, the internal mechanisms and processes of the forest. And when those are working, we'll get to old growth condition. What I'm worried about is, those areas where they may not all be working. There might be invasive plants and things. And then I don't know if they'll get to that endpoint we all hope, or if they'll get stuck in a sort of a successional loop where it's simplified and so forth.
So on that side of it, where or why might you want to take a more active approach and try to manage for those characteristics?
Yeah, great question. So I think there are a number of reasons to do that. One is we have come to depend on and we rely on forests for a variety of essential benefits, including wood products. And it provides the opportunity for us to diversify our forests through silviculture, and therefore diversify the benefits across that landscape. So we can, we can produce wood products. We can diversify age classes for wildlife habitat using active management. I would suggest we can move stands away from vulnerability towards resilience through active management. And so I think there is good and compelling reason to do this from a public benefit, landowner benefit perspective. I also think, and this is a part of what we discuss in the publication, I also think there are opportunities to speed up that successional clock to achieve some of the structural attributes and meet those species targets using active management. So, for example, one of the diagrams in the publication is two timelines. One is if you take a passive approach, we estimate it'll take roughly 100 years to reach the tree size targets that you would expect to find in an old growth forest in a variety of forest types. And therefore, with that large tree, can start achieving the dead wood and so forth. But we estimate with 2 to 3 crown thinnings, you can achieve that large tree target and all that comes with it in half that time. Mm-hmm. Now, importantly, using silviculture doesn't make the tree older, right? It can make it bigger. We can change density and focus resources on the remaining trees. However, it doesn't make it older. So I'm not suggesting we can speed the clock up from an age perspective. And old trees are unique. They develop different kinds of bark. They have different crown architecture based on, the types of disturbances they've gone through. They have these wonderful decay columns, that woodpeckers and insects love. I mean, that's what creates the cavities and so forth. So we want old trees. That's an important characteristics of old forests. But there are characteristics we can speed up using silviculture while achieving some of these other benefits that we rely on and landowners are interested in achieving.
Mm-hmm. And I like that idea that you can actually do something to get toward and kind of thinking about that characteristics, maybe not necessarily defining, but being that portion of it that we can impact. And so what would be some of the characteristics that we would think about with old growth and the things that we might be able to impact or change along the line?
So I've been talking about the fact that our forests are ecologically young relative to what we would see in an old growth forest. So let's talk specifically about what are the characteristics that we would associate with an old growth forest and how do they differ from our current second growth forest? So some of the things that we want to look for or would look for is a diversity of tree sizes. So one of the things that is often weighted very heavily when we talk about old growth is big trees, right? I mean, we all love big trees. I mean, part of the reason I think most of us went into forestry is because we love big trees. And they are, in fact, a really critical attribute and characteristic of old forests. But to only focus on big trees would in some ways discount the other characteristics and the complexity of forests and things. So big trees is important, but remember, these are dynamic systems. They were subjected to periodic disturbances at very regular intervals. So that means that there was a lot of tree mortality, and that gives the opportunity for young trees. So ironically, one of the characteristics of old growth forest is sort of a diversity of tree ages. We would have old trees for sure, hundreds of years old. And I think, side note here, I'm continually blown away by my colleagues' work relative to aging trees in old growth forests. And I don't think we really know I don't think we really know how old our trees get. I don't think we have a good sense of that. I have a colleague who recently cored a black birch tree at 300 to 400 years old.
Wow.
That's not, that's not my impression of black birch. And of course, we can't say it's a population. It was just one tree, but we can say at least one tree made it that old. So we don't really know how old, our species can get. So we would have, trees in old growth forests that are hundreds of years old, and we would have these younger trees because of these disturbances. Related to that, as foresters know, not necessarily directly related, but related to that is size, right? So we would have old trees and young trees, big trees and small trees. We would have sort of that diversity, vertical diversity, including trees. So what's a big tree? Over 20, 25 inches, probably in our region. What's an old tree? Over a couple hundred years old. So that's an important characteristic. The other important characteristic to remember is, along with sort of vertical diversity, we have horizontal heterogeneity. In other words, if you were to take an aerial look at a forest, we would have some areas of that forest that are large trees, well spread out, older forest. We'd have some areas and gaps that, are fighting it out. They're saplings or poles, and they're like real tight in there. And then, of course, the rest of it would be sort of somewhere in between. So one of the things that's important from a characteristics perspective is these forests are really gappy. They're really patchy. And again, that's an attribute of, or a result of, this regular shifting mosaic kinds of disturbances across the landscape that may have ranged, sort of generally from 0.1 acres to a couple acres, and then periodically some of these mesoscale landscape kinds of disturbances. So we would see, this difference, and these different areas have different environmental conditions, right? Some are real shady and moist, some are open in sun, and some are in between. So hang on to that thought. So when we talk about silvicultural strategy, that becomes important. The other, of course, really important characteristic of old growth forests is the amount of dead wood, both standing, but also down dead wood. And so, some of Tony's research quantified something in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 times as much, more down and dead wood, at least in our Massachusetts forest. Hemlock probably had more. We have a lot of hemlock old growth in Massachusetts. Oak might have, oak, for example, might have a little less, but lots more dead wood for sure. And importantly, in various states of decay. So we're going to have some standing trees that recently had a tree top snapped off, and the bark is really solid. It's a solid wood tree. We're going to have some that the bark is sloughing off, and we're going to have some that's at the end of it and it's mushy. Same with down dead logs. Again, think about that regular pulse of disturbance creating mortality. So we're seeing that as that happens, we're seeing wood, inputs of dead wood at various times as the disturbances happen, and they provide a sort of a conveyor belt, if you will, of inputs. That becomes really important in terms of the silviculture as well. Different species, will utilize that wood at different times. The last characteristic I would say is these old growth forests can have different understory plant communities, real low disturbance kinds of plant communities. They're oftentimes spread very slowly. They might be seed dispersed using ants, like ants might be the big mover in there. So they're not moving thousands of miles, they're moving, tens of or hundreds of feet. So it takes a long time for those communities. I think in squirrel corn or cohosh and those things, sort of in a northern hardwood stand, are good examples of that. So I would say those are really the characteristics of an old growth forest, and again, we are accruing some of those in our current forests, and we're sort of on the front end of that. And the question is, how do we restore those missing parts, with the idea that, and I guess this is in some ways an assumption, but in other ways is proven out in different research, the idea that our forests, when they have all of their parts, when they have all of their processes, are more likely to be resilient, and to move through these challenges that we face, be it climate change or invasive plants and so forth. Now, I can't point to one mega study that bears that out, but I think from a common sense perspective, and Leopold said it, right? We're missing cogs and wheels.
Yep.
And we want all of those cogs and wheels in our forest to face these threats.
Looking for continuing education credits? Check out the SilviCast webpage for more information. And now, back to our show.
I think talking about those characteristics, Paul, kind of leads us into some of the silvicultural tactics that foresters might be able to use to enhance or add those characteristics to their stands. So I guess that's something that I would really like to hone in and talk about. And so maybe the obvious one to start out with is if you're looking at a range of tree sizes, particularly larger, older trees, that would be a tactic of retention of some kind within those stands.
Yes, absolutely. So I think for a lot of us, we're dealing with stands that are probably predominantly single-aged or even two-aged. And how do we move those to all-age stands and stands with greater variability? And so I think the first thing from a silvicultural perspective is recognize where you already have some of these characteristics. Don't start at square one, right? Build off of what you have. And so inevitably, you're likely to have some down dead wood, or you're likely to have a little microburst that came through and knocked some trees down and so forth. Identify those first, right? We always, forestry, we should always be identifying what we have and what we're keeping first. So we want to regenerate our forests, but also retain a significant amount of that cover. And that cover, the amount that you retain, is going to be dependent, at least in part, on those species targets. So employing strategies, let's get very specific. Employing strategies like single tree selection, group selection, irregular shelter woods, variable density thinning, looking to move stands. And remember that patchiness, that gappiness of forests across, if you're looking horizontally, if you're looking from an aerial, we want some areas that are going to be open. So those are regeneration. So that might be a gap, a single tree, might be a small patch. We want some areas that are left alone, right? So they can develop those dark, shady conditions. And we want some areas that have that intermediate. So we want those different environmental conditions across the forest. So employing regeneration strategies or silvicultural systems that seek to do that and maintain some amount of overstory, let's put it that way, because I want to come back to that gradient idea, is very important. So with that kind of silvicultural system implemented, it sort of carries with it a couple of different things in terms of reaching those characteristics. One is the retention of those larger mature trees helps meet the goal for large trees and old trees. Maintaining some of those trees, and this is a difference between sort of our standard silvicultural system and this approach, designating some of those trees, either individually or as patches, as legacy trees, we call them legacy trees, but retention trees, so that they can grow old, live out their life, develop decay columns, develop cavities, get really big, serve out, their life, provide these really wonderful niche-rich environments, and then fall on the ground and do the same thing, is, an important strategy. So this allows us, to reach that large tree and that old tree type of condition and characteristic. That thinning between the gap and the do nothing is that opportunity to both increase the size of, speed up that successional clock and increase the size of those trees, those diameters of the trees. And then, of course, leaving those patches allows for those understory plant communities and so forth to develop over time. We want to be very cognizant of our deadwood inputs. where are you, currently? And this becomes an inventory question. Can you quantify, how much dead wood you have? And can you plan out periodic inputs of that dead wood, such as we would see from the contributions of disturbance? So let's unpack that a little bit. So we know that there are these we know that we're low to start with, right? We don't have as much dead wood as we would have. And we know that they came in pulses. So when you are doing a silvicultural intervention, having a timber harvest and implementing some silviculture, plan for that dead wood. How much, that might be a contractual thing. How much are you leaving? It might be, intentional dropping of trees. That can focus on the unacceptable growing stock. That doesn't have to be your veneer oak, so there are opportunities to increase that dead wood, but you're not going to be out there with a timber harvest every year. So how do you plan for those periodic inputs? And that in part comes back to the designation of those legacy trees. Let those legacy trees grow old, die on their own, or snap off, and plan for some of those periodic contributions of dead wood. And so we very much focus on silviculture, right? That's what the podcast is about. But, also develop sort of a strategy for morticulture, like how do you plan for, this dead wood input through time?
I was just thinking about this week. I was out with some foresters, and my observation is we oftentimes are very focused on the regeneration. We're focused on the harvesting of the forest product, and that is all that we should be focused on that, but we often don't focus on identifying and retention of those legacy trees. And it's really, as you said, there's a range of variation in terms of how intense you want to do that but it's a pretty easy or simple practice, I think, that we could add to almost any regenerative harvest to improve those benefits that you're talking about there.
Absolutely. And that puts us squarely into this conversation about the gradient. At the lightest end, so to speak, implement your standard silvicultural system like you were going to, meet your goals and do that, but designate a handful of trees per acre as legacy trees. Let them live their lives out, add that structural component. The more you're interested in developing these characteristics, the more basal area would go towards those legacy trees. So you might have a landowner who, as a primary goal, might say, hey, this is really important to me. I want to hit these old growth benchmarks. That would entail either sort of a passive approach, which would be 100% of the basal area, or it could be something like 50% of the basal area or 60% of the basal area. And then in between that retention, you'd be trying to hit your marks in terms of your species composition. And then it could be, moving down the gradient, you could do 20 or 30% as the retention, or 10%, or at the lightest end, as I said, it could be a couple trees per acre. You're going to, we give some benchmarks that Tony pulled from the literature on what, if you're at that point where you're hitting those benchmarks, you're likely in, that ballpark of old growth forest condition. And you're likely going to hit that faster, obviously, if you're on the end of the gradient that is retaining more and allowing those processes to develop. However, for some, that might not be their primary goal. It might be complementary, meaning it's important as the others, but not more important. Or it might be something that's sort of a secondary goal. It's sort of nice to do it, but I've got these other goals. So
Right.
Depending on, the landowner's goals, you can sort of adjust this accordingly. From a landscape perspective, if everyone were to be somewhere on the gradient, we would, at a larger landscape goal, be restoring the characteristics of these forests, moving them closer to how they would have evolved. And there would be an increasing amount, or hopefully over time, a critical mass of these characteristics. And now we're starting to, to break down, so to speak, the parcelization and just seeing the characteristics knit together across a landscape. And maybe it's from a passive approach, maybe it's from an intensive active approach that's retaining some, and probably it's somewhere in between. And so, over time, hopefully, we would help these forests, restore those characteristics.
This is really fascinating. And so it feels to me, and I didn't actually think about this earlier, but it feels to me like stand assessment is really important here because you need to know a lot about that stand, not necessarily for the, say, that production side. It's about like you need to know like what are the large trees we have in here? How many dead trees do we have? How many downed trees are in there? And would you go if you did something like that, would you assess a stand later on and say, hey, maybe we don't have enough dead wood here. We need to actively create some dead trees or go out and girdle something just so we can speed that process up?
Yeah, absolutely. Those are great. 2 points I'll address separately. One is, so the second one, yes, I think there are opportunities to be active and non-extractive, right? That's
Yeah.
sort of the step, not quite to passive, but you're active and non-extractive. You can go into stands and drop trees or even girdle trees to help, periodically promote that pulse of dead wood. And I actually worked with a conservation organization, Mass Audubon here in Massachusetts, who in fact did do that. They had a timber harvest on part of the land, and then in the back 10, 20 acres near some vernal pools, they sort of wanted to play with this character or play with these strategies and move the successional clock forward. And in fact, they did that. And it was wonderful because not only did they drop trees and girdle trees, but they started playing like and being creative. They girdled half the tree in the hopes that, that might last a little longer and be a different pulse of dead wood. And that's the kind of
Yeah.
creativity I love in foresters. We can come up with these strategies and sort of write them down and describe them, but man, the rubber hits the road when the boots are on the ground, and that's the art of it. Sort of the creativity of the application of this based on the individual characteristics of the site and the landscape. I do think, and to your first point, I hope some to a lot of this is being collected sort of in a standard inventory. I hope so. I might be being a little naive, but I would think, from a diameter,
maybe.
Yeah.
optimistic. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, so let's break it down. From a big tree perspective, folks are collecting
That would.
diameters.
Right.
Yep.
I assume most are designated live or dead. So I
Yep.
think, or I hope,
Yeah.
or if they're not, I don't think it's a big jump. When you're doing your overstory swing and cruise, you can catch that. I think the bigger challenge is probably on the dead wood side. Whether folks can do transects from plot to plot. That's what I've encouraged some of the local foresters here to do. Doing some line intercept method. Dropping a few 100 feet of lines or transects when you're traveling from site to site. I think you can get a real good sense of that. So that's sort of the geeky academic quantitative way to do it, I guess, in some ways. The other way to do it is qualitatively, right? Like you're at the site, you're at Plot Center, just like you'd look around and say, oh gosh, there's Japanese barberry here, or there's a lot of deer browse, and you might note that on, Plot 14. Just developing an eye, calibrating the eye. Seems like there's a lot here, there's not a lot. I think just any attention towards those characteristics will benefit or inform the decision.
Yeah, that's probably the tougher one for foresters to incorporate into a standard cruise because it's generally not there, at least for us. But the notes part of it is very easy to add on to at a plot level.
Yeah.
Yeah, wait till we get the LiDAR going. Then we'll have
I
all
know.
the
Yeah, then you
information.
just sit in your office and record.
Yeah,
it
that's
there.
right. That's right.
Paul, going back to some of these tactics, we talked about legacy tree retention, trying to create spatial variability with some of our silvicultural systems that we choose. You had mentioned earlier also crown thinning in terms of just trying to speed up some of the development of trees. Would those be the legacy trees that you would try to speed up that development, or maybe overall you could do it both ways?
I think you can do it both ways. I think on the regeneration side, focusing the silviculture on combining the removals of individual trees and groups of trees, canopy trees, is the regeneration portion of that. And so those systems that give you that combination of individual and group, I think is what we're looking for, as it mimics our natural disturbances and provides that spatial heterogeneity. The thinning part of that, I think, can come in between those regeneration patches of various sizes and can focus on, or should probably at least, on those legacy trees as a way to increase their size to give you those targets, those big tree targets that we're looking for. It also, provides, going in and doing some a portion of the energy is being spent on regeneration, right? Single trees and groups. And then a portion is being spent on that intermediate treatment of thinning, provides different environmental conditions across the stand, we hope, so that some areas in the patch are going to be dry and sunny. Some areas are going to be moist and dark in the do nothing or in the patch reserves. And then, we'll have these intermediate kinds of sunlight conditions in between. That's great in the sense that if we want to regenerate different kinds of species, we want to create conditions across the stand that favor those. So we might get more intolerant or mid-tolerant in those gaps. We'd probably get some mid-tolerant maybe in those thinnings. And then, maybe it's the opportunity for the shade tolerant in those areas of patch reserves. So from a resilience perspective, we want to focus, I think, on opportunities to diversify the regeneration pathways within the forest. So maybe it's sprouting, maybe it's from seed, maybe it's shade tolerant, maybe it's shade intolerant. Like the more opportunities that forest has with different environmental conditions, I think the more opportunities we're going to have for species to be successful and at least some of those to make it through the challenge.
Yeah, and I could see we might want to tailor those regeneration types of gaps and patches and openings to what the natural disturbance mechanisms would be for the forest types we're working in. So some of those might be smaller, and other systems, it may have been typical to have larger ones. So we can tailor those a bit.
Absolutely. And that gets back to sort of this foundational principle of ecological forestry, which is that historic range of variability and sort of matching, or as you say, Greg, mimicking that disturbance to what would have been in that landscape, with the caveat of also keeping an eye, and I'm sorry, I feel like I'm kicking a dead horse, always keeping an eye on what we want to regenerate. And it might be that we may want something a little bigger.
Right.
If the species predicted to do better in the future, are more drought tolerant or more shade intolerant, shade mid tolerant, then we might want to consider, at least in some of those patches, open that up. And I don't think that's, it's not uncharacteristic of our landscapes. We did see some of these mesoscale kinds of disturbances.
I was going to ask about that because so you guys in the Northeast might have had maybe more hurricanes that would occasionally come in and kind of cause that. Maybe here in the Midwest, we might have tornadoes or, downbursts that would do things like that. But that would still, some way, shape, or form, those could still inform or be a part of, or kind of emulating at least a little bit of that, could be a part of old growth management, maybe, but considering all the characteristics that we've talked about.
Absolutely. I think the disturbance history helps set up the sideboards that we work, within as foresters, mimic and play that out relative to the stand characteristics and the landscape that we're in. Absolutely.
Yeah. And we've talked about when we've had those larger scale disturbances, just incorporating some of these principles in the salvage operation, where we maybe don't salvage portions of an area, or we leave down trees that have an intact tip-up mound, because in some cases we've discovered we cut the log off of there, the tip-up mound flips back and it closes.
Yeah.
So you can, even in the salvage part of it, you can incorporate some of these characteristics.
Yeah, I would highly encourage that, because remember, what the disturbance did is move the clock forward in advance, create these characteristics. And in some ways, the salvage may be reducing the amount of characteristics, right? The amount of dead wood and so forth. So I recognize there's an economic implication to this. I recognize there's a safety, potentially piece to this, or a fire piece to this. And so I don't want to be too naive about it. But to the extent within the constraints you're working in, you can sort of let that go, which is very hard up here in the Northeast, that Yankee mentality of getting everything out of the woods.
Every stick. Yep.
Every stick. You're not going to let that get out there and rot, are you? So, it's within the constraints and the goals and so forth. And that's that gradient, right? That's that gradient.
Yep.
So you're doing your best to contribute the characteristics you can, cultivate the characteristics you can on a parcel by parcel, and hopefully across the landscape, it adds up.
For foresters, we're people of the plan, right? Like we like numbers. We like to see things kind of go a certain way. And you guys did a nice job of kind of quantifying some of this. Like, here's what you might want to leave in certain size classes or things like that. What about people in other places that maybe don't have that, right? So we know that old growth is important. We know that the characteristics are important, and the characteristics might be the foundation. But what if we don't have really good targets for how much of certain things to have? Is there a way forward for something like that?
Yeah, I think just the focus on complexity, the focus on, we like numbers, right? You're exactly
Yep.
right. And actually there was a forester when we sent this out to review, we sent it to a number of people across the region and mostly practitioners. And that was something we heard, and poor Tony was tasked with, creating those benchmarks from the literature. We like that for sure as a profession. But I think even the qualitative just focus on the characteristics, the complexity, and how it integrates into the site and the goals for that landowner, I think will be steps ahead. And that's good, right? We as long as we're moving in the right direction, I think that's important.
Paul, I think there's just so many different aspects of this, right? Silviculturally, we could dig into the weeds in this for a long, long time. But I do want to also offer to the foresters out there that we will put your publication on our show notes so we can dig a little bit more into the details. And we also, in Wisconsin here, we have the managed old growth study. There is some publications on that, a little more technical oriented. We don't have one quite as nice as the job you guys did. So we can put that in the show notes as well. So I just want to kind of mention that before we close out here.
We'll have a link to the publication itself so that people can take a look at it. Because I think there's a lot we can, we're slightly different here as far as the composition of our forest and things like that. But a lot of the discussion, I think, is going to be really pertinent to the things we're looking at.
Yeah, that would be great. And I'll also send you a link to a webinar we did that if,
cool.
If people are interested, it's recorded. And so if people are interested in seeing the graphics and at least hearing us sort of walk through the publication, they can do that. I guess, do you mind if I mention 2 points that occur to me that I would?
No, perfect.
First point I would like to make is, at least in the Northeast, there have been growing conversations about, the do nothing pro-forestation passive approach.
Yeah.
And I've seen and have felt, no question, sort of a bristling of forester, like, ooh, like, no, that's not, we gotta, we want to manage things and that's taking acres off the table and they just don't understand and so forth. And I guess I've sensed a real defensiveness. And of course, this is just personal perspective, but I would encourage us as foresters to consider, again, that the passive approach is complementary to the active, both at the stand, the property, and the landscape level. We are the profession that know how forests regenerate. We are the ones that know how they develop through time. We are the ones that know these species and so forth. Mm-hmm. So I wouldn't take us, or please don't take yourself out of the conversation, even if it's a forest that's passively, managed. That's still a part of our profession. And rather than drawing a smaller circle around our profession, I think we should be drawing a bigger circle around our profession. And that includes, the parts of our landscape that are passively stewarded and the way in which that passive and active come together as part of a larger complementary approach.
We've had this discussion before.
Amen. And whether it's old growth or it's oak savanna, right? Like basically, I always think there's a super danger a real danger that if we expect others to deal with those and not us, then why do you need foresters?
Right.
Right? Because if you can't give me everything I want, well, then why do I need you? If I only need you for a timber sale now and then, well, then you slowly fade to irrelevance.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And these are changing times. They're changing fast. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for our profession. I don't know, not that I'm as old as Greg, but I've been around a few years, who just had a birthday, so happy birthday,
Yeah.
Greg. Which is why I say it. People are going to wonder why I threw Greg a shot.
Yeah. It started out that way, folks. So
it's almost his nap time, so we'll get him there. So it's okay.
But, in my, however many couple decades of my profession, I haven't seen so much focus on forests. I feel like there were years where we were screaming, look at us, and no one, with climate change, carbon and biodiversity and wood products. And so this is a wonderful opportunity for us to be in the light. In fact, like it or not, we're in the spotlight. So now it's a matter of how we react. This is a wonderful opportunity for us to demonstrate who we are and what we offer to these critical issues.
Yep.
The other thing I just wanted to mention, and it's a part of the second thing that keeps me up at night, is the loss of forest cover. And I know my sense is that many of your listeners are working in some way with private landowners as a consultant or a service forester or a county forester. And I want to just reinforce the importance of conservation-based estate planning and keeping forests as forests. It is, at least in the Northeast, the biggest driver and most permanent driver of land use change and loss of forest benefit. We can have lots of great conversations about forests and different strategies for carbon and biodiversity, but we need forests in order to have those conversations, particularly with restoring old growth characteristics. When you create early successional habitat, you can do so in a month or two. And the next growing season, you're going to see a response likely from wildlife. It's not like that with restoring old growth. It's decades or even centuries. And so pairing all silviculture with conservation-based estate planning, formal tools that help landowners pass on their land in as big of a parcel as possible with as much forest cover as possible, is important with all silviculture, particularly these goals, to let these forests have their time to sort of their processes to work and your strategies to be fulfilled.
Well, Paul, this was a great conversation. There's a lot of, we could go on. There's a lot of different aspects to this, but really enjoyed talking with you today. And I know that others will enjoy that as well. So thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm greatly appreciative of the work you two do. This was a fantastic vehicle for reaching people. So congratulations on developing it and implementing it so gracefully. And I appreciate it. If anybody had questions, they're certainly welcome to reach out to me.
I don't know that anyone's ever called SilviCast graceful, so that was that's a unique moment.
Yeah.
But no, and Paul, we really appreciate the conversation. This was fascinating. This was really good stuff. So an open invitation, if you ever get to the Midwest, we'll sit down, we'll have a couple beers, and we'll really dig deep. We will find those the rabbit holes.
Outstanding.
Hey, everyone. The Dropbox is still open for business in Season 5, so keep those questions, comments, and ideas coming. And if you don't have anything interesting to say, I'll be forced to have Brad tell us about his latest favorite reads. Brad, what are you reading this week?
So actually, we won't go down the rabbit hole here, but I was reading some really cool stuff about ecological memory and about how kind of it ties into some of the stuff we've been doing. And Greg, give me 45 minutes, and I think we can really tease this out well.
Oh, I'm going to doze off again.
Yeah. All right.
That wasn't what I was expecting. I thought maybe it was that book you're reading on how to say no, Brad.
No, I couldn't finish that one, Greg, because you just can't say no. People ask questions. In any event, thanks for listening to today's episode of SilviCast. If you have ideas for future episodes or a question for the Dropbox, please let us know. You can reach us at UW-Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center by emailing wfc@uwsp.edu. Feel free to include a sound file of your question or a comment if you like. We learn best when we wrestle with questions, so keep them coming.
Take care, everyone. And as always, thanks to our team. Our Season 5 sponsors, the Nelson Paint Company, McCoy Construction and Forestry, and the Family Forest Carbon Program. Susan Barrett, our editor-in-chief, Logan Kaseha, our IT master, theme music by Paul Frater, and of course, UW Stevens Point's Wisconsin Forestry Center.